Hi, I'm Vladimir Pankrat. I'm Associate Vice President of Indigene Regulatory Affairs based out of Princeton, New Jersey. I'm very glad to be here today to introduce an exciting and interesting topic, and I'm joined by several very interesting industry leaders from across the pharmaceutical perspective. I'm here to speak about a topic around establishing a nimble and strategic regulatory organization in a time of transformation. One of the things that we've seen in regulatory over the last couple of years has been an increased focus on the speed to market. And this is always important and paramount to the regulatory organization to ensure that this is happening effectively. Likewise, there is an increased complexity in the product portfolio that organizations are having to manage. And what that means is that on the backdrop of this, both conversations with health authorities, other organizational priorities need to be considered. And then now consideration of what are the accelerated pathways that might be an opportunity for organizations to bring those products to market and to the patients that are in need of them as well. Now, in the last couple of years, what we've seen is an interesting trend, not only digital and approaches to managing regulatory function with technology, but generative AI and how generative AI is beginning to influence both responsibilities as well as what are the use cases that might be able to be embraced and how that might further advance not just acceleration, but increase intelligence in the way that regulatory function operates. We'll be exploring the organizational needs and how do we ensure that there's both a nimble and strategic organization in regulatory affairs, and looking to hear from the panelists that are here to speak a bit about that from their experiences. How do they steer organizations? How do they influence the direction and priorities for their organizations and ensure that that agility rate maintains within the function itself? I'm joined by three leaders from the industry with perspectives that are coming from responsibilities across regulatory affairs, regulatory operations, and digital innovation. Collectively, they'll be able to provide their own unique perspectives around what they're responsible for and what they're seeing, not only from within their point of view, but based on their observation of the industry itself. Number one, I'm joined by Joe McLaughlin, who's from Pfizer, Tim Twells from Novartis, and Thomas Seck from Boehringer Ingelheim. And maybe just going around the room, maybe I can ask each of you to introduce yourselves in further context. I'll start with Joe.
Thanks for having us. Joe McLaughlin from Pfizer in regulatory operations. And I lead a group around innovation, data governance, and excellence, really how we take a concept and make sure it actually really happens. So really, this topic is really powerful for us.
If I could, Tim, maybe you can introduce yourself as well.
Thanks very much, Vlad. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm the lead of global enabling functions at Novartis, coming with well over 20 years of industry experience, always within the regulatory operations space. Really energized and excited about exploring new ways of working, large transformations, and matching technology solutions to business needs. And of course, how we translate all of that to the people that are impacted. So really looking forward to today's conversation. I think it's fantastic topics. Thanks very much.
Great. And lastly, Thomas.
Yeah, thank you, Vlad. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Thomas Seck. I'm the head of global regulatory affairs for Boehringer Ingelheim. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion as well. I think it's a highly relevant topic for any regulatory affairs organization in the industry. And I'm happy to contribute, but also learn at the same time. So thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you, each one of you. Maybe just to kick things off, going back on the topic that I introduced, and Thomas, I might ask maybe from your perspective first. I brought up the mention of being agile or nimble and strategic as well. And in some ways, these could be competing forces for a regulatory organization. I'm curious from your perspective, how do you see that coming to life in the way that you try to approach regulatory for yourself and your organization?
Yeah, I think I like that we start with a definition of what we mean, because it's easy to say, strategic and nimble, and then we are talking about very different things across. So maybe I take it one by one. Strategic in general, my definition that I typically use is that you are really informed in your today's action and decisions and prioritization based on a vision and a longer term goal. And to me, that means to be strategic. In a modern regulatory affairs function, since we are operating in an environment where we have very long development cycles and a high level of volatility, I think it's really critical to be strategic and have a strategic mindset. And that means to me being proactive as a regulatory affairs professional, go really beyond compliance and documentation, which might historically be a little bit of what we did in regulatory affairs. It's about designing strategies, regulatory strategies that are really grounded in understanding of what the brand or the pipeline asset that you're working on wants to achieve, and understanding the business around it. It's a lot about cross-functional collaboration. I think if you want to be strategic, you can't do that in a regulatory affairs silo. And it's navigating regional complexities as well, right? Which we have to navigate, given that typically our development programs are global in nature. So it's that, to me, all of those aspects are pertaining to what it means to be strategic in regulatory affairs. The Nimble piece, to me, is clearly related to it. And almost you need to be strategic in order to be nimble as well. It's almost like a requirement from my perspective, but in the end, it means that you're quick to adapt to change, either change that happened to you from the environment or from internal reasons. And I think in order to do that, you have to be also focused on that vision that we talked about, right? The longer term vision, based on science, business priority, and regulatory environment. So to me, these are the key topics when we talk about strategic and nimble and what it means for regulatory affairs as a starting point.
Great. Thanks for that, Thomas. Anything you'd like to add, either Tim, Joe, any further perspective from your side?
Well, Vlad, I just like the way that Thomas starts with the definition. And I was thinking specifically from the nimbleness perspective about how nimbleness isn't just quick of movement, but it's also quick of mind. That ability to flex your thinking in order to be able to meet the immediate needs. I'd also say that I think regulatory has a really unique perspective because it really is the one function that looks across the full life cycle. And I'm sure we'll touch upon this in more of our conversation, but that gives us a responsibility across development to really be identifying those strategic opportunities that Thomas was talking about.
Yeah, and I think in some ways I've kind of reflected on it I've akined it to the great octopus. There's the requirement to not only be the voice box out to the industry as it relates to the health authorities, but also try and steer the ship internally as well. Sorry, Joe, I think you were trying to say something.
No, this is good. I think adding to both, I think to really, and we'll get into it, enable is give people the right framework and trust where they can act inside of it, right? How do we push decision making out? How do we give people the power to actually drive, at the same time have the right metrics in place and the right rewards in place, so people feel like they can actually bring that to life as we go forward.
So when we talk about this organization and the broad responsibilities that sit across different functions, and these are conversations that have happened in my experience of what I've seen as well, organizations sometimes look at how do they create more of a driving force and centralizing those organizational responsibilities that can maybe create commonality in the ways of working, ensure that there's not regionalization of activity as well. It might increase visibility for the organization and the ways of working and what is the outcomes, and trying to address some of these performance objectives as well, Joe, in line with what you mentioned before. But it does seem as well, where's the right balance between what you might consider to centralize or decentralize organizations? And there might not be one size fits all. So I'm just curious, I don't know, Tim, maybe with your experience, I'm curious if you can talk a bit about that.
This is a topic that I find really fascinating because I think we've seen across the industry a bit of a flip-flopping over time, where we've moved from one model to another based off of trends or more importantly, I suppose, the business needs. And I think you hit upon the most important part at the end of that, Vlad, is that actually this is about identifying what's right for you, what's right for the organization at that time. And we've seen the successes potentially of centralization from a cost perspective, from an efficiency perspective, from the increase of control. But as a result, we sacrifice that local expertise, potentially. We sacrifice that local scalability. For me, I think the latest trends that we're seeing across the industry that we're probably reacting to is how we simplify our organization. So actually the organizational structure is more being driven towards something that's simple, and how we can use that simplification to adopt and maximize the latest technologies, right? We've got opportunities with respect to automation, but that tends to drive towards standardization. You have to standardize the way you're working in order to be able to use the new technologies that are available to us. And so I think what we will see moving forward is a little bit more of a hybrid model, where we bring together the bulk processes, the bulk business processes, in order to standardize them and gain the efficiency. But we hybridize that with the in-country input, the importance of the in-country scalability or local knowledge. So, you know, I've in my previous roles in previous organizations, I've tried both, and I'm getting to that position now where I'm thinking, actually, we need to be thinking a little bit more flexibly, a bit more hybrid, based on the actual situation, the business, and the timing.
And I might imagine some of this might relate to the relevance of what we know, and the knowledge of that might exist within the markets, right? So you might still rely on that to not only just have that knowledge, but also be the great communicator back to those market authorities, essentially being able to navigate the requirements around that, because they're most intimate with those activities that are going on there. What we have to do as it relates to the operational aspects of, you know, taking content and moving up from where it is to actually preparing it for health authorities might be something that we could continue to evaluate to centralize. I've seen sometimes the knowledge might be the question mark. Do we centralize that, or do we localize that?
Vlad, something interesting that came up the other day for me is a change in terminology. So we've always talked about global being the above country, the standard ways of working before we drive down into the country. The new way of thinking, the new definition for me is global is the end to end. It's the start in the major markets with the major applications, and taking that responsibility all the way through to the global final submission in countries. And that sort of turned on a bit of a switch for me in my mind. I was just like, yeah, actually, even the terminology we're using has to change a little bit in order to address the new needs of the industry.
And I think to that point, I fully agree with what both of you said, but Tim, around also the solution being, you know, I think if somebody tells you this is the way to do it and that's the best way, you have to be super cautious, because I think there is no best way. I think it has to be tailored to your specific needs, your specific organizational goals, but also to the culture you have in your organization. I think all of those you have to consider when you make these decisions. Clearly, there's benefits to centralization, and that we're exploring that, especially in the data field and digital, quite a bit, because if you need to build new capabilities, that's much easier to do in a centralized model, I would say, in general. On the other hand, and I think you alluded to that as well, you know, in some instances, centralization actually inhibits nimbleness, at least the nimbleness of the local organizations. And, you know, some areas where we see the local knowledge is super critical, and we want actually locally driving some of these aspects. It's around regulatory intelligence. It's very local. You know, obviously for the bigger markets and the focus, what we call focus markets, we have an oversight from a central perspective as well, but we can't do that for every single location and region. And the other aspect is labeling, right? I think there's another example where I feel like the localization, the local labeling rules drive a lot of the strategy, and you therefore need the local expertise to help you to come up with the best possible label for your assets.
Mm, mm. And if I could ask, I think just an interesting double click on that. For example, you have organizational requirements that might sit centrally, and there needs to be a collaboration then back into the markets itself, using the example of label for as a case in point. And with that comes understanding what I do, what you do, understanding how do we collaborate, what are the approaches to that. And on the backdrop of that, drawing back on the earlier topic I mentioned around faster time to market. So you would argue there's a limitation. At some point, there needs to be people that are coming together, that are talking, that are discussing and deciding to get to a conclusion. I don't know, Thomas, if that's kind of a use case example of that, of how you divide organizational responsibilities internally in a central versus in an affiliate or in a local market.
Yeah, I do believe, we talked about global development, right? And global development strategies. In the end, I think most companies pursue that at this point in time because it's a way more efficient way of bringing innovation to patients. In that context, you do need a global strategy, which, however, needs to be informed by especially key markets that you want to make sure you have the innovation available. And that should be a dialogue and a discussion. And then, obviously for a very small market, it looks maybe a little bit different, right? Where it's very clear and very directive in terms of how the strategy looks like and what are the key claims and indication and so on. That is something that we standardize. But then around that global strategy, there's also elements that need to be aligned in a dialogue between global and local.
Mm. And underlying within there, obviously, in that communication, data quality becomes paramount to make sure not just what is being discussed and said, but likewise how decisions are made that can ensure that there's continuity in what is being decided upon, and that the underlying data that is produced not only for submission, but likewise in the management of the organization is properly maintained as well.
Mhm.
I don't know if Joe, you have a perspective on that.
Just to build on it to the collaboration and how it really also comes down to having very well-defined roles. What is my role? What is my decision authority? So as you do that collaboration, and someday a decision does have to be made, right? And how do we move forward? Who owns it? Who drives it? And how does that, it's not a one-off, right? How do we continuously inform it as we go forward? And to the earlier point about being nimble, make those adjustments. It's just not a one and done. And having that infrastructure in place, from roles, process, tech, to actually enable that global collaboration and that conversation, is so important now as we go forward, regardless of the model. It really comes down to that collaboration, the data, the standardization in that mechanism.
Got it.
And
So,
but
sorry,
I would just add about the data quality piece. I think that this is such a complex area. There is so many different data points that as sponsors need to be managing. I think one way that leaders can approach this is through prioritization of where our true priority data sets, what that looks like with respect to high-level data management programs, etc., and not stressing and sweating too much on every single piece of data in every part of the organization, right? And I think this is the way that we're going to win, because otherwise there'll be new data points created and thought of every day, right? And you're just trying to pin them all down as equal. So I would say that not every data point is equal, and prioritization is a way and a method in which to try and fight them.
It's a little comforting to hear that, so that we don't have to stress the small stuff.
Yeah, said and done, Brad. That's the problem, right? You can say it, but then you've actually got to try and actually get that prioritization agreed across the whole organization. And the problem is we've got mixtures of priorities, right?
Sure. So when we talk a bit about that agility and this area where we touched on the organizational design, and obviously it's got to be fit for purpose. And the one market A doesn't equal market B, product A versus product B, and the focused attention that's required around that. That agility, I gather, is an important part of this. But then as we move forward, I know there's been snippets of mention on technology as well. Underlying within there becomes the talent and the organizational responsibilities for that talent to either skill or be skilled in certain responsibilities. And I'm just curious how you are looking at this as we continue this journey with technology, and what that means in terms of the people's readiness for that. And likewise, what will be important, not only from the technology perspective, but likewise from this agility perspective, being strategic, like we touched on that. How do we ensure that people are focused on that skill set? And what are some of those skill sets that you think might be important for people to look at and begin to maybe fine tune or sharpen the pencil around? I don't know, Thomas, maybe if you might chime in, maybe others will have a perspective as well.
Yeah, happy to chime in. This is a $1 million question, I guess, in the end, but I can give you my thoughts. I think if we look specifically in line with the theme here about strategic and nimbleness, I do believe you have to enable your employees to be able to make decisions in an agile, basically empower them to make decisions, right? And there are many aspects around it. It's organizational design. It's, to Joe's points, it's roles and responsibilities which need to be super clear. And it's in the end also culture. I said that I think before. I think the culture that you instill in your organization is critical to enable risk taking, doing innovative things, and others, right? I would say, to me, there are three areas that I would prioritize, and that is based on what I have experienced. It might not be the same for others, but I think that clear understanding of the cross-functional partners and needs internally is really, really critical. If you're not able to understand what others need, it's really hard to make good decisions in a timely fashion. The second point I would emphasize is the external focus. Clearly regulatory affairs, that's our job, to be externally focused, but sometimes, we just take what comes from health authorities versus actually engaging in an active environment where we also shape policies. In the end, health authorities and us have very similar purposes, right? We want to bring value to patients. And I think there is an ability to dialogue on what's the best way to create these innovations. So that external mindset is, for me, the second important point. And then lastly, and we talked about data. I think where decision-making becomes complicated is if the evidence is not clear, right? If the evidence is clear, it's very easy to make a decision. Unfortunately, for most of our decisions, it's not that clear, and they're more or less in a gray zone. And I think what I think is important is to enable the organization is to lift or move more of these decisions in a more clear black and white fashion by providing data on aspects that actually helps them to support a decision. That, to me, is the power of data, and that's how, to me, data then empower also nimbleness and strategic decision making and so on. So maybe these are the first three areas that I would emphasize from my perspective.
I agree with everything that Thomas has said. I would just like to add, with respect to the skills and talent that I think will be successful moving forward, there's two elements that I think will be important. One will be resilience, because we're working in an environment that is accelerating with respect to speed of change. And the second is innovation. So this ability to think non-linearly, to come up with ideas that aren't just sequential, that actually make a shift and a directional change. From a talent and skills perspective, if you can have the resilience to ride out the change, and if you can train your mind or learn techniques in order to actually jump with respect to your innovation, I think that's the way that groups and individuals will be successful in the future.
And I think to build on it, it's just that looking for people with those natural curiosities, right, to really drive. And I think there's other skills. We talk a lot about AI and the technical, but really to bring to life what you both said, it's people being able to tell a story, bring it and bring people in, right? And negotiation skills. So similar, as you said, both internally and externally with our partners, how do you navigate that, right? How do you push the conversation in a way? And I think they're really these softer skills can't be forgotten about in terms of as we go through this, because it's really going to actually drive what we can actually do.
That's an interesting one, Joe. I think reflect on two aspects to that. Thomas had highlighted the importance of being able to not only understand what health authorities are saying, but being able to even negotiate policy. So, I mean, there's nothing more important than being able to consider how does this relate, and is this an effective policy? And to be clear, policymakers are doing their best, but sometimes from experience that's coming from within the industry, there's an opportunity to really shape a better conversation and say, well, is this really best for patients? And that's an important thing to keep in mind in the way that we're working. But likewise, then it's internal as well. We've got to consider that there's always competing priorities and things have to get done. And it's not about what's important to me, but it's important to maybe bring perspective, I guess you would say, that there's maybe a new point of view, just like each of you are coming from your own unique perspective and responsibilities across regulatory. I would imagine that's also likewise something that people have to think about as well. I'm curious though, Tim, I think I was hoping you could maybe elaborate further on the backdrop of your title itself, because that, I think, what I would probably akin to historically had been regulatory operations, is now transformed itself. So I was hoping maybe you can elaborate a little bit on what does that mean to you and how did this happen that you've got this new title, I guess you would say.
Yeah, Vlad, I think regulatory operations has been defined in different ways for since it first existed, right? It is essentially a collection of capabilities, and those collections have grown, shrunk, changed, and morphed over the years that regulatory operations has existed. I think what we're seeing at the moment is the next iteration, the next evolution of regulatory operations. And one thing about the title of regulatory operations is the operational element, right? The inclusion in the title suggests a heavy emphasis on operations. And personally, I think the high volume, more routine work is actually something that's being done in a totally different way now across the industry, whether that's using different types of resources, different types of technology, different types of processes. Ultimately, that high volume work is being delivered in different by different routes. And so the title of regulatory operations needs to change in order to represent the more strategic nature, the more problem-solving elements that's always been there, but has actually now grown to being more important. So my own title of enabling functions is more of that catch-all of a broad range of capabilities that runs as a horizontal across regulatory affairs, serving all parts of the life cycle, just like regulatory does. The new set of regulatory operations capabilities needs to serve that full breadth end to end, and representative of the fact that operations have always been natural problem solvers, but also highly engaged with technology. And so our role's shifting, and so potentially so should our title.
Likewise, yeah, that's exciting. And what's interesting is when you look across the industry, and obviously smaller companies might size their organizational structure in one way compared to a very large pharma that needs to consider how do we separate roles and responsibilities to be effective, and that's got to be a consideration as well. But this function of regulatory operations, I've seen where the ownership and responsibility of technology in itself sometimes exists. Now we've got technology owners sitting within regulatory affairs, we've got digital partners, and the complexity then continues. I'm just curious, and maybe Joe, looking to your direction on this, how does this become a partnership moving forward with different roles, responsibilities, and making sure that the lens of perspective of operationalizing and automating and innovation continue to come together?
That's a great question. And I think it's something that is truly evolving, as Tim said, from a platform. It's having everybody at the same table. So for us, it's really starting as joint outcomes from our digital partners to our cross-functional partners. We really make sure we're all going to the same endpoint overall. And then just really bringing it together underneath that, it really understanding what it really takes to get it done. And then, as Tim was saying, in terms of some of the data, put the stuff that's really not getting you in that place to the side. right? It really comes down to focus, and we all have the same focus and an equal voice, right? We're really looking for the push and the pull. We're looking for our partners to push us in our thinking the same way back, and giving that environment, that safety, right? That psychological safety for folks to really do that at all levels, to have that. You still need to make a decision at the end of the day, but we really want to curate that push and pull across the organization where everybody's got an equal voice. Digital can push us the same way we can push them.
So as we think about this push towards digital, I think, and I'd love to at some point hear a little bit more about the latest and greatest on generative AI and your perspectives on this across. But I think springboarding from what you said, Joe, how do you see this, and what recommendations do we look at to make sure that there is this culture of transformation? I think you alluded to it a little bit, but I was hoping maybe you could elaborate further.
It really comes down to changing the DNA, I think, and giving people that right mindset and that right safety to actually enable, right? Really taking it from theater to practice. And I think it first starts, as we talked about, what are the endpoints that I'm really going for? And having everybody focus, know why they're important, know why they actually link to them, and then have the leaders out there talking about them, what it means to them, encouraging people to speak up of what it means for them, and then reward the right behaviors at the end of the day. And that doesn't just mean success in terms of we hit it. That is actually the behavior saying, I took a risk, I tried something, and I knew where to stop or where to pivot. We don't do that as well as we should be, and really calling that out, because that's what's going to drive a culture of innovation where people can try. They did it the right way. They did it thoughtfully. They did it strategically, but they also knew when it's not working out and I can stop and raise my hand, and that's okay. Right. And we pivot and we go somewhere else, and we do it as quickly as possible. And we need to embed it. We need to put the frameworks in initially stronger before the culture really kicks in. Right. So how do we have innovation cafes? We have innovation hubs where people can put their ideas in and can crowdsource each other in terms of building off of each other. We really have to double down on those structures to really give it, because it's just not going to happen organically all the time and at the pace we want it to happen all the time.
And I'm curious, because there are barriers to adoption when we talk about, again, some new technology, and the fact that this may change the way of working, and trust begins to become a question. I'm curious, how do you change that? How do you really encourage that a little bit more? Joe, I think you touched on some mechanisms to kind of creating this openness and creating a confidence that it's okay to experiment, it's okay to evaluate, but also be conscientious of this is not working and why, and let's use this as a learning, and that's okay as well. But I'm curious, how do you continue to create more of a pull mechanism versus a push mechanism for this?
I think
sure.
some of it.
Thanks,
Go ahead.
Thomas.
No, Joe, go ahead. You're on a roll.
I don't know about that. But I think similar to Tom, Tim, and other leaders, our leadership in-house and regulatory, they walk the talk, right? They talk about their journey of what they've done with Copilot. Our head of regulatory went through and how they've done different things of AI. They've shown it, right? They show the impact it's had on their lives, right? So they are hands-on bringing it. How we use data, that's not curated, right? We're bringing up live dashboards instead of spending time building Excel files and PowerPoint. And live data is good data, right? At the end of the day. So I really think it is actually just it in action. Sorry, Tom.
And I think it's a great. I can only agree with you. I think that is the key to me in order to create an environment where innovation can thrive, including digital innovation, which obviously is taking hold of all of us across all functions. Actually, not only regulatory, but it has to be instilled in regulatory as well. And traditionally, I would say regulatory affairs is, as an organization, somewhat risk hesitant, right? And we were often initially an established function to manage risk and minimize risk. And therefore, it doesn't come natural to a regulatory affairs organization to say, I take now risks, right? And that requires, to Joe's point, installing that trust. That in certain areas, obviously, we don't want to take risk around compliance. We don't want to take risk for patients, but we have a lot of areas where we can take risks to do and try things in a different way and extract value, so to speak, innovation. And I think the key here is always the situation when if something doesn't work, because if you have a punitive kind of environment and finger pointing and why didn't this work and we invested so much in it, that actually has a huge effect on how people feel about the risks they take moving forward. So I think that topic of culture and trust and risk taking is a critically important one for any innovation, but in particular digital. And then to Joe's point, I think we are all on that same journey of learning, right? I mean, I had to learn how to use Copilot, and I'm very proud of my achievements every day now that I have used Copilot in a successful way. We need to share that, and we need to continue to emphasize the workplace of the future will look very different for all of us, and at the same time have confidence that it doesn't mean it's the worst place. It might be actually a more attractive place to work in. So I think it's a couple of these topics that are really important to install a culture where innovation can thrive.
So from my perspective, I think both Joe and Tom have just brought up some really, really interesting concepts about failing fast, turning an environment and culture, which is probably one of the most important words used throughout that whole just piece, into a positive, supportive, failure okay environment is hugely important. But I just wanted to add one extra thing about people not being afraid. And in an environment, and we see this across broad society as well, not just within our industry, being afraid of new technology, being afraid of what it means for their role, for their job, for their place. And I think this is something that we've got to address head on, that nobody sees artificial intelligence taking away the industry. It doesn't take away the jobs within the industry. It may change what we're doing. It may change the emphasis. It may support us to do more of the thinking rather than the doing. But what we've got to do is encourage people to see that the opportunity within that, and remove that fear element from them, so that they can innovate, so that they can look for the best possible ways of doing a task without that fear of, is this going to remove my role, my place, my value in the organization? So that's just something that I think as a group, as an industry, we need to be thinking about, talking about a little bit more.
And with that, Tim, I think, when you say more thinking and the doing might be the opportunity that frees you from having to, there is an onus, there's a burden, there's a big responsibility to preparing submissions, you might say, and going from the point of entry of taking knowledge, off of whether it's clinical insights or manufacturing insights, and then preparing a dossier, for example, to the point of actually orchestrating all of that and actually compiling all of that, can be, I would imagine, opportunities that we can all begin to explore in a roadmap approach. Very likely, it's not something that you just do this always in a big bang. I am curious about that, though, because big bang versus experimentation, there needs to be a happy medium behind that, because otherwise you're in paralysis by continuously experimenting, and at some point you just need to say, let's go. I am curious about that in terms of how do you create a balance to experimentation and then just deciding that we need to, in some ways I would call it, pull the Band-Aid off and just move forward.
Well, I think that's a great question, Vlad, and there are other elements to be considered in it. If I can avoid answering it for a few minutes longer, I will do. But I think that the considerations I'm thinking about is that return on investment as well, right? Which can be really, really difficult to actually start quantifying. And what I see regularly happening is case studies that are presented. It's the right thing to do. It's actually the quantification, the arguments, the boiling it down that is the difficult part. And so I think that's probably something we've got to get better at. Within regulatory affairs, I would like to see us stepping back even further than we have done previously, and looking for case studies that are even more holistic. So we talked at the beginning of today's discussion about regulatory being that touch point across the full life cycle. I think at the moment, some of our artificial intelligence case studies are still very regulatory focused. They're very much internal pointing. I think we need to step forward and take some of that responsibility to actually start connecting together some of the other functions and take that accountability, as you describe it, Vlad, for pulling the final submission together and really expediting, facilitating the speed up of that creation of the submission content and then final submission through to decision. So I think regulatory has a slightly different role to play. I'm not totally sure I answered your question, but that's why we've got
No, it is, yeah. But what's exciting is you're talking about breaking silos, essentially. The traditional silos that we've created just through time might have to be reevaluated. Not to say we're going to remove those responsibilities, but we need to be able to consider what are the touch points upstream and downstream. So we're not just thinking within the box of my beginning and end and my responsibility, but also what happens, where does the label go at the end? It ends up on a digital asset ultimately, and the responsibility of making sure that that content, the knowledge around that is continuous, maybe throughout the entire life cycle of that knowledge, might be an opportunity, just as a case in point. But I'm curious, within your organizations, we touched on Copilot, a little bit on generative AI. Are you seeing that there's an enthusiasm and an excitement to begin to embrace this technology in certain pockets? I'm curious if any of you can maybe elaborate a little bit more from your experiences. Are you seeing a curiosity and interest in use cases that really begin to show some level of adoption already in some cases?
I think we've seen a big shift from the early days to now, where there's definitely a pull for more of it for the individuals, because I'm also seeing the way we've set it up in terms of recognizing people in a positive way of how they have applied it. It's like the person with AI is going to beat the person without AI, right? It's another tool and how to use it. But really seeing these people emerge that have really taken it on themselves and really become power users of AI within their function, with CMC, within labeling, and really bringing those functions to life, and they're being spotlighted, right? So now people are seeing, again, back to rewarding good behavior, right? They are now leaning in, I need to start doing this as well. So now it becomes more of a pull than a push. And I think we're seeing that pivot point overall.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think we all see that. I think you clearly have initially a small group of individuals who are or employees or team members who are very enthusiastic about new technologies and the ability to use that to simplify work and helps them focus more on the important stuff. And I think these trailblazers you need to highlight, to Joe's point, right? And I do see now that everybody, most people understand this is a critical skill and technology we need to utilize. Otherwise, we're not going to be competitive in a very quick time frame. And that's where I think you get a critical momentum behind it. And I think that's where we all want to see our organizations go.
So what I'm hearing is,
quickly step in and say one area that I see as a risk here, which I completely agree with what Joe's saying around people are stepping forward and volunteering for this. I think one thing that we've just got to be aware of is providing them the framework as well as the support, right? So we don't want this to become a wild, wild west equivalent of the Excel documents on everybody's different desktops that you then can never track down and find. So for me, with respect to the innovation around automation and technologies, it's great to see this embracement from people, the education that people are taking on spontaneously and independently at an individual level. What we need to give them is the scaffolding in which to be able to thrive in that, right? So it's okay having the big case studies, having the big items that we can drive at an enterprise level. We've got to encourage them at the lower level, that's citizen-led automation or technology advancement, but the scaffolding has to be there. the framework in order to be able to govern that, control that, make sure that we're not duplicating effort or spending resources in unnecessary areas without returns.
That's exciting. I think that what I'm hearing is obviously embrace change, create that agility and nimbleness and willingness to explore and experiment, be bold. Essentially, the one challenge area that I'm hearing is we need to really double down a little bit more on how do we ensure we can extract or identify business value in what we want to change or transform. Essentially, when we're especially now looking at technology, these become some important things to think about. I know we're kind of wrapping up, coming on time. Any lasting message, any lasting points that either of you might want to, any of you might want to kind of bring out before we wrap up here? And I think that we've pretty much covered a lot here, but I really do appreciate your time. It's been a really exciting wealth of information from each one of you. Do appreciate it, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Vlad. Tim,
Thank
Tom,
you.
as always.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks a lot, guys. Yeah.
All right. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.